for the show, the Tatiana Show, where you make friends and talk life and crypto. Well, that was the very first Tatiana Show jingle experiment. So that was really fun. Hey, Josh, welcome to the Tatiana Show. What do you think?
I'm welcomed and I'm impressed. There's always
all right. We're gonna play the full jingle at the end of the show. I want to dive right in with Scott, but before we do, I just want to remind people I've got a couple upcoming shows that are on the agenda. I'm going to be playing at the Voice of Chicago in Chicago, or Voice of Blockchain in Chicago, August 24th to the 26th. Then I'll be on the cruise, the Contra Crewman cruise, which is going to be fun. Also going to be on the crypto cruise going out of Barcelona, September 7th through the 11th, if you guys want to catch up with me there. And I'm also playing a show this Thursday night for my birthday, and it's in New York. Everybody's always asking me to play in New York. I never want to play because it sucks. But it's a really great venue, Rockwood, and I'm playing with my writing partner and producer or whatever, and we always we never get to play together. I always have to play the guitar myself, and I'm not very good. So it's going to be a much better show because he's a very good guitar player, and I can focus on singing. I wish you're coming, Josh.
That's what I'm talking about.
All right, so let's talk about war. All right, that's why we're bringing up Scott Horton. He's our resident expert, good guest from previous shows. We've talked about a lot of different things. He's got his own show, Scott Horton Show, and he's probably one of the most knowledgeable people that I know about the topic. And it's always a pleasure to have him on. So we've got him for a little bit less than an hour. Thanks for coming on the show, Scott. Nice to have you back.
Hey, happy to be here and talk with both of you guys. And happy birthday, Tatiana.
Thank you. You sound so upbeat, and yet you work in a depressing field at times. And so tell us what's going on. Is there any reason for hope? What's the latest from the streets? We've got Russiagate. We've got wars in like 8 countries, which we listed earlier. So we're not going to run out of things. But I like to let you take the lead because you're so much more knowledgeable about this. I just know anti-war, bad, government should stop bombing, the usual. But we can get into the nitty-gritty. So what do you want to talk to us about today? I'm psyched.
Well, you said you wanted to go over Russia stuff, so I think that's probably a good idea.
Okay.
Yeah. It's one of these things that have seemed to have come. There's a resurgence in interest since Trump. And somehow, as soon as Trump was getting elected, somehow Russia came back. Suddenly, the Cold War was back, and we're all very excited to see this picture all of a sudden back on the lips of everyone, especially on the left. It just seems like it came out of nowhere. I mean, Russia was in Europe. Yeah, Russia was a bit of a story always because of the Syria story and stuff. But really, it wasn't on the lips of Americans.
Right. Yeah. Well, and the thing of it is this is still the old Cold War. I mean, we sometimes call it Cold War II or something. But the fact of the matter is that Bill Clinton started up the Cold War.
Wait. Before we start talking about Cold War II, I'd like to get a little bit of a Cold War I. Preface, no, or are we jumping right into 2?
Well, we can do
people that don't know. I don't know Cold War I. I suck at history. I know about overarching themes. Like these guys seem like they did a bad job, but I don't know about that stuff. So, and I imagine that some of my audience is as uneducated on this subject as me. Yeah. So, can we give it a little bit of preface? Because I think that's really where that's what I thought was really interesting about the Middle East, just how it was like tribes just like 150 years ago. Who the hell knew? Right. So anyway, continue. Sorry to drive it in that direction, but.
Yeah, sure. No, that's fine. So, without getting too deep into the first Cold War, the basic outline of the thing is that at the end of World War II, all of the industrial powers of the earth had been razed to the ground. Of course, Japan had been leveled, and all of the European powers had been completely destroyed, including the Russians. And the United States emerged, virtually untouched. And so America really, England was completely bankrupted. Germany was destroyed. France had been occupied and destroyed. And so the United States basically inherited all of the world empires of the European powers, plus Japan. And with the exception of the Soviet Union, which had, in defeating Nazi Germany, had occupied all of Eastern Europe, all the way up to and including Eastern Germany. And of course, then a few years later, China fell to the communist forces of Mao Zedong, defeated the American-backed nationalist Chiang Kai-shek. So China and the Soviet Union, had their own communist bloc alliance, and the rest of the world fell into the hands of the Americans. And the Americans basically took up the mantle of world empire and global dominance from that point on. And
the separate, I live in Berlin, I'm working here, and really you see the whole history really played out here, where Berlin was separated into the quadrants of the French, the Russians, the British, and the Americans, and Russia basically built a wall around Berlin to say, well, the rest is east, even though it was circled. The rest is east, it belongs to us. And then the amazing thing of these planes, these American planes landing every 2 minutes at the airport, delivering food for the Berliners, because we were basically being starved to death here. Well, I say we. And
look, that whole situation represented the Soviets backing down after the death of Stalin. Khrushchev had threatened to invade Western Berlin. And so, this is really a strange artifact of history, where the city of Berlin was entirely surrounded, was in East Germany, it was entirely surrounded by communist forces. And only the western half of the country, the western half of the city, was under the control of the Americans and the Brits. And the Soviets had threatened to invade and take the western half of the city, which they absolutely could have done, but it probably would have led to nuclear war. And Jack Kennedy went over there and said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," or whatever, meaning that the Americans will not allow this. He drew the red line and said, "We will not allow it." So Khrushchev backed down and instead built the wall around West Berlin as, to save face, basically, because so many people stuck behind communist lines were fleeing into West Berlin. And then from there, were able to fly out and get to Western Germany and to the so-called Free West, to flee from the Iron Curtain, from communist enslavement. And so in order to prevent that PR disaster from continuing, and in order to prevent nuclear war from breaking out, the communists went ahead and built the Berlin Wall at that point as, kind of a half measure.
And little fun fact there about the language, when Kennedy said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," it's actually "Ich bin ein Berliner." That's the normal High German, Hochdeutsch, where "Ich bin." But the Berliners, they don't say "Ich," they say "Icke," "Ich." And so when he said "Ich bin ein Berliner," he kind of Berlinified it. He sort of took the local nomenclature and really, the accent of the Berliners, which was also something that not many people know about.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure I said it worse than he did, but yeah. And the point being that he was drawing the line there, and that the Soviets backed down. Now, the deal is the Soviets had lost 27 million people in World War II. And so, they defeated the Nazis in the East, but they lost everything in doing so. And they really were never an aggressive threat against Western Europe. The idea that they were going to roll into Western Germany, France, Spain, try to conquer England or any of this was always a fantasy. It was never really true. But
I don't think that the Polish people appreciated it then. Just saying.
I'm sorry?
I don't think the Polish people felt like they weren't a threat. I mean, they were effing with us forever.
Well, but the Poles were already conquered and already had been lost. They were in the East. We're talking about Western Germany. The Elbe River was the line. And the Soviets had no intent of crossing into the West. But the excuse was that we had to contain them. So they created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, to be the Western military alliance in the name of keeping the Soviets out, even though they weren't really coming anyway. And so, Gareth Porter, in his book, Perils of Dominance, about Vietnam, he says the real problem here was the Americans were so much more powerful than their Soviet rivals that they kept getting themselves into trouble. They had this attitude that no one can stand against us. If we want to, invade and conquer North Korea, we can do so. Nobody can stop us. If we want to break off South Vietnam from Vietnam and create a separate state there, what are the Chinese going to do about it? Because they were so much more powerful that they thought they could get away with anything. And they refused to recognize that these other powers had their red lines. And so in those two examples, look at what happened. When they conquered North Korea and they went all the way to the Yalu River, the Chinese flooded 1 million fighters down into Korea to force the Americans back down to the 38th parallel again, leading to the stalemate that we've had since 1952 in Korea. Also in Vietnam, they never really invaded North Vietnam. They sure bombed the hell out of it. But they dug in and said, we are going to hold on to South Vietnam and continue to keep the French puppets in power there. And so China and Russia both, they didn't invade and send in troops, but they sent in money and they sent in material to help the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese guerrilla forces continue to resist and keep the war going until finally it was such a quagmire that the Americans had to basically give up in defeat and go ahead and withdraw. And so, they kept basically digging themselves these holes under the idea that nobody can stop us. As George W. Bush said, bring them on, right? Because who could possibly stand against the U.S. Army? The fact of the matter is that the Chinese and the Russians both had interests that they were not willing to sacrifice. Mao Zedong himself said, hey, in nuclear war, maybe they'll kill a few 100 million of us, but who cares? We've got a few 100 million to spare. Which is a pretty commie attitude.
Pretty messed up attitude.
Population, but I'm sorry?
Pretty messed up attitude, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. But the point was that he was making it clear that you think that you can just completely push us around and we will, have to submit to you. But the reality is, no, we won't. Yeah. We will shoot back. And of course, the Chinese ended up exploding their own nuclear weapons in the 1960s and proving that they had the ability at that point, not necessarily to deliver them to the U.S., but certainly to destroy our allies in Japan or whatever like that, American forces in Okinawa. And so that was enough to basically call that stalemate. But so to fast forward through here, when we got to 1988 and the wall came down, and the people of Eastern Europe started fleeing to the West, that was basically the end of the story for the communists. It took another couple of years, and it was Christmas 1991 before even Ukraine and Belarus and the Baltic states, the Soviet republics, broke away from Russia, and they brought the red flag down and put up the red, white, and blue Russian flag over the Kremlin, and the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Hardly anyone was killed. I mean, there was some fighting, I think, in Romania, but basically this was the Velvet Revolution, where the Soviet Union just ceased to exist. The greatest miracle in the history of mankind, really.
It's amazing. Actually, the story is coming here out of Berlin about the night that the wall fell. The guy in the East basically was reading this thing saying, yes, we're going to take down the wall. And he didn't know when, actually, but someone said, well, when is it? Someone in the crowd. And he said, well, now. Like, he didn't really even know at the time. And in fact, it wasn't meant to be now, but he said now. So everyone went, yeah, and just rushed towards it and just started climbing. And the rest is history. But actually, yeah, the fact that it wasn't actually meant to be now. It was just the fact that he read it then, this official sort of read now, and then it was too late. The whole
well, in fact, the way it had really started was people were crossing the border into Austria, which was neutral. They weren't part of the West or the East, weren't part of the Warsaw Pact or NATO. And once people started fleeing into Austria and the border guards refused to shoot them as they fled, that was basically the beginning of the end. It was just, I think, a few weeks later, the wall came down in Berlin. Right. And then, the barbed wire fences between East and West Germany came down and the flood was on. And, it's interesting, right, that the leftists, the communists, they were the stodgy old conservatives, and the right, the capitalists, were the youthful, revolutionary, the forces of change. And capitalism had defeated communism once and for all. Of course, the Chinese had abandoned communism in the mid-1970s when Mao Zedong died and Deng Xiaoping took over. He said to get rich is glorious. So they're still ruled to this day by the Communist Party, and they still fly their red flag. But they're much more a fascist dictatorship than a communist one now. With rudimentary markets anyway.
Can you just clarify the difference between a fascist and a communist dictatorship? Like, what would the distinction be there? How would that play out?
In a communist state, the government owns and controls all of the property, all of the means of production. Everything is a government program. That's it. In a fascist state, it's what we call in America a public-private partnership, where the means of production are privately owned but controlled by the state. And then, of course, those elite, most rich people who own those means of production, they're the ones who control the state and control the way the state controls the property.
Wouldn't that almost make America a fascist state because of how the government and business are in bed together? Wow, I'm good at this.
Robert Higgs says it's a participatory fascism.
And especially
we still have elections. And we still have competing political parties, but only two. And our elections are only so meaningful. And at the end of the day, what we call the special interests, the bankers, the arms manufacturers, the old people lobby, the pharmaceutical companies, the agricultural firms, they control the Congress, and therefore then the Congress controls the way business is done.
Yeah, and I mean, it was quite scary when Trump, and a lot of people cheered him for this, but when Trump actually got the car company that was moving to Mexico and then had private dealings with them, giving them all these cuts and special qualifications, I felt that was a very, very big step towards more of a fascistic way of governing, because really everyone should have a level playing field. And many people cheered on this deal for this car company because it came back to wherever it came back to, but within the States. But still, you sort of feel a bit icky about that because you think,
I don't think he's the first guy to do anything like that. I don't think that's very good PR. And I imagine that he's actually reduced a lot of the regulations. That's what I've been hearing. I don't know. Compared to the other people, I feel like he's actually less so, but I don't know.
Well, he has cut a lot of regulations, but really only on the margin. I mean, we've had a very activist government, what they call a mixed economy or a quasi-free market since the 1930s and Franklin Roosevelt. And it is, as you say, it is a fascist state, but it's not, we don't have a dictator for life. We don't have, absolute martial law and totalitarian rule and total lawlessness in our, criminal system and whatever. You can still be acquitted in court some of the time in America anyway. So it's an American fascism carrying a cross and wrapped in an American flag. It's not exactly Italian-style fascism, and it's not Nazism. Although if you're on the receiving end of the empire, you might not know the difference. And so that's really the point here, right, is that when the Soviet Union fell apart, the American empire did not. And the American empire supposedly was only here to protect the world from Soviet communism. Take, for example, Pat Buchanan, who was a right-wing conservative, a Nixon and a Reagan speechwriter. He and Jude Wanniski and Scott McConnell and a lot of these guys who were right-wing anti-Soviet hawks. As soon as the Soviet Union fell apart, they said, all right, that's it. It's time to bring all the troops home, abolish NATO. It's time for America to be, even Gene Kirkpatrick, the neoconservative, Ronald Reagan's ambassador to the United Nations, says, now we can be a normal country in a normal time. Now we can go back to being a constitutional republic. William F. Buckley of National Review had written in the Commonweal magazine in 1953, I guess, or 52, that we must accept a totalitarian bureaucracy on our shores in the name of the emergency to protect us from the Soviet Union, even with Truman at the reins of it all, because of the danger of Soviet communism. But then the promise was when communism was gone, when the threat was gone, America could go back to being America again. This was just temporary. This was just because of the emergency. Well, Pat Buchanan and the other paleo conservatives said, all right, well, we're holding you to our promise. That's it. Let's abolish the empire. But what did the empire do? The empire, first thing they did was find an excuse to invade Iraq and occupy Saudi Arabia. And the second thing they did under Bill Clinton was they decided to break George Bush's promise to Mikhail Gorbachev and begin expanding the NATO military alliance east. And so they brought in Poland and they brought in, I forgot which all countries in which order, but through Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama, they expanded NATO to include virtually all of Eastern Europe. And in fact, the countries that are even further east than what we ever called Eastern Europe, including the Baltic states right on Russia's border. Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia are now members of the NATO military alliance and have American troops on the ground there. And then they talked about and threatened to even bring Ukraine into NATO. Remember Homer Simpson said that Canada is like America Junior? Well, that's what Ukraine is. Ukraine is Russia Junior. And for America to threaten to bring Ukraine into the NATO military alliance, the equivalent would be if the Russians tried to bring Canada into the Warsaw Pact under the Soviet Union. And so that's the degree of aggression. If you put the shoe on the other foot, imagine what would happen if the Russians overthrew the government of Canada twice in 10 years, which is what America did in 2004 and in 2014 to install America-friendly governments in Ukraine. And then in 2014, not only did they overthrow the government, but the government then hired a bunch of Nazi militias. And these are the guys, they're not just like American neo-Nazis. These guys are literally the grandsons of the men who fought in the Galatian SS under Adolf Hitler and under Himmler and participated in persecuting the Holocaust against Ukrainian Jews and Poles and murdered them by the tens and tens of thousands during World War II. And these are, real ass Nazis, not just, rednecks out in the woods in Alabama somewhere. These guys are dangerous. And they went immediately once they overthrew the government in Kiev in 2014 and the Russian speaking factions in the far east of the country refused to accept the coup junta that had overthrown their democratically elected president. Then the government in Kiev declared a war on terrorism and invaded and launched a bloody war against the people of the East. So now again, with the shoe on the other foot, what if the Russians had done this in Canada? What if they'd overthrown the government in Ottawa and then they'd hired Nazi militias to attack and murder and bomb the French Quebecers who had refused to accept the rule of the new junta? And I mean, the answer is obvious. America would have gone to nuclear war. America would have dropped hydrogen bombs on Moscow and St. Petersburg is what America would have done in that event.
Do you think so? I mean, because Russia is so well armed to the teeth as well. I don't know if they have the ability just to jump straight to the H. Because
in fact, I mean, what they did was they sent special operations forces to help back up the rebels in the East and help them repel Kiev's rule. But when the people of the East in the Donbass region, it's called, in Donetsk and I forgot the other one off the top of my head real quick. But in that region of Eastern Ukraine, when they voted to rejoin Russia or to join Russia, Putin said no. Putin refused to accept them because they're more trouble than they're worth. And he didn't want that much trouble. But what he said, and this is in the WikiLeaks, thanks to Bradley Manning, Chelsea Manning, and Julian Assange, we know from the WikiLeaks and the State Department cables, I believe it was Nicholas Burns, who had a meeting with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. And the document is titled "Niet means Niet." And what happened was Sergei Lavrov said, listen, if you bring Ukraine into NATO, we will invade and conquer Ukraine. We can move our troops. And Putin himself said this in 2008. We can occupy Kiev in 2 weeks. Try us. And in other words, the red line is drawn here. Perils of dominance again. The Americans think they can just get away with anything. Well, you can't. You want a war with us, you'll get a war if you try to bring Ukraine into NATO. And so I mean, if you look at any and all of this from the Russians' point of view, you can see how the Americans are absolutely
infuriating. They're total a-holes. I mean, it makes you feel bad for them, for the Russians, because it's like the Americans are just the big beast and they're going around beating everybody up. You know, when you're making China and Russia look good, you're not doing a good job. Right. So what do you think of, so do you think that Putin, because I think that sometimes Putin sounds like he's really got some interesting things to say that sound like he's, you know, on team good. But then, you know, he's got other things that are definitely not on team good. What's your take on him? And the Russian government, like, because it sounds a little bit like we're becoming almost pro-Russia in this conversation, because it's just obviously we're being jerks.
So,
right,
you know, the truth favors the Iranians. When everyone's accusing Iran of making nuclear weapons and they're not, then I guess I'm pro-Ayatollah when I debunk the liars, right? It's the same kind of thing here. I'm not taking Russia's side. I'm just saying, you know, I'm a Texan, right? What the hell do I care about Russia? I'm just saying that the USA government, Bill Clinton, George Bush, and Barack Obama, they're the ones who picked this fight. That's just the fact. That's just the reality. And that doesn't necessarily say anything good about Putin. It's just to explain that everything that Putin has done, the worst things that Putin has done, like seize the Crimean Peninsula without killing anyone, by the way. And then he held a referendum where 80-something% of the people, and there were German observers who verified this, that it was a free and fair election, and that 80-something% of the people of the Crimean Peninsula voted to rejoin Russia. When he sent the special operations forces in to back up the so-called rebels who were refusing to accept the rule from the Nazi-backed coup junta in Kiev, when he sent his air force in to bomb the CIA's Al-Qaeda forces in Syria, and killed a lot of civilians. He's killed a lot of civilians in doing so. There's, you know, that's not, I'm not saying that's heroic or good, or necessarily even justifiable, although it's getting pretty close to justifiable in terms of not necessarily how they did it, but what they did in going to back up Assad in Syria there. All of these things are in reaction to America's foreign policies and America's absolutely unjustifiable foreign policies. Screwing around in Kiev, where we have no business whatsoever overthrowing their government there, any more than the Russians have the right to overthrow the government in our country or in Canada or Mexico. And you look at Syria, where really the worst of what Vladimir Putin has done, it's in the face of the CIA, Barack Obama and John Brennan and the CIA committing literal high treason. Dictionary, U.S. constitutional definition of treason, providing aid and comfort to the only real enemies of the American people on this planet, Al-Qaeda. Guys they're known as Jabhat al-Nusra or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham now in Syria, who are sworn blood oath loyal to Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of Al-Qaeda, the butcher of New York City. And this is the reason. And the reason they do it, as Barack Obama explained to Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic in 2012, as they agreed, is this is a way to take Iran down a peg by getting rid and doing a regime change against Iran's friend Assad in Syria. Now, Iran and Hezbollah and the Ba'athist government in Syria, they didn't knock our towers down. They didn't kill 3,000 Americans on September 11th. And when you look at Iraq War II, out of 4,500 Americans who died in Iraq War II, 4,000 of them were killed by the Sunni-based insurgency, which included Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's guys, who in 2006 renamed their group ISI, the Islamic State of Iraq, making it very clear what their goal was: to turn Western Iraq, the predominantly Sunni regions of Iraq, into an Islamic state. It was only made possible first by George Bush destroying the Saddam Hussein secular Sunni-dominated government there, and then made that much worse by Barack Obama supporting these guys outright in their war against Assad. And so what was Vladimir Putin supposed to do? In fact, one more thing here. John Kerry, you can find the audio of this, where John Kerry and one of his aides meet with some Syrian rebels, so-called rebels, in London. And they're complaining, John Kerry, do more for us. Give us more money. Give us more weapons. And John Kerry says to them, and this is in 2015, this is after 4 years of treason, And John Kerry says to them, look, guys, we gave you guns. We gave you money. Syria's lousy with guns right now. They're everywhere, okay? And we saw the rise of the Islamic State. Not just al-Qaeda fighting, but ISIS that was determined to carve out a piece of eastern Syria and western Iraq, erase the old Sykes-Picot border between the two, and create the Islamo-fascist caliphate of bin Laden's dream and George Bush's propaganda lies, right? This is ridiculous, and yet they made it possible. And John Kerry says, listen, we saw the rise of the Islamic State, but we thought we could manage. And that we would use that to pressure Bashar al-Assad to resign from office and leave power. But he didn't do that. Instead, he went to Moscow and asked Vladimir Putin for help. And Putin said, okay. So here, the Islamic State and al-Qaeda forces were ready to sack Damascus. And Vladimir Putin said, all right, that's it, and sent in his air force to bomb the CIA's al-Qaeda forces. So whose side are you on?
Man, it's so confusing. There's so many sides. It's really hard to keep up. And this was
so what happens when, I don't know, like, you know, there's these elections coming up, right? And I mean, I have my doubts about elections being legitimate in the first place after seeing what happened with Ron Paul and whatnot. But, you know, every time you come on the show, I'm left, you know, kind of depressed because it's like, what do we do? You know, I mean, it's good that people know about it, but is there anything that people can do? Or is this just, you know, trying to stem the flood of dead bodies as state overruns everybody? I mean, is this something that, like, I guess crypto would be my only solution for it. Otherwise, I'd be like, we should be in utter despair. Because if we don't have any power, how do we get them to stop, right? Where's the incentive? Do you think that Trump is a worse warmonger than others? What are your thoughts on him?
Well, so that's an interesting question, right? So first of all, on the elections, they can rig the elections, but only on the margin, right? They were able to steal Iowa from Ron Paul, but only by a couple of points, right? If Ron Paul had been 10 or 15 points ahead, they wouldn't have been able to do a damn thing about it. And that's what happened with Donald Trump. Donald Trump got in there and he stomped Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio into the ground. He had no competition, you know, in the Republican primary whatsoever. And Rand completely forsook his father's, you know, principle and campaign and anti-war and anti-central banking platform. And, you know, Donald Trump would have stomped him anyway, but he barely even tried and ended up, you know, he was, you know,
nobody was going to win
marginal even than Rubio.
You know what I mean? You can't fight that guy. He's like a blob of like evil. Like you can't fight him.
Yeah, I mean, Trump was ruthless. I mean, Trump basically accused Jeb Bush of being unable to pleasure his wife, right? Like, can you imagine? Can you imagine a presidential campaign? And can you imagine Jeb Bush saying Marco Rubio has low stamina? Marco Rubio, how's he supposed to be your alpha male when he can't even get his wife off, right? That's what Donald Trump said about Jeb Bush. Donald Trump would stop at nothing to destroy those guys, and it worked. Jesus. It absolutely worked. So, and then look who he was running against in the general. He was running against the worst person on the face of the earth. He was running against Bill Clinton's wife, which, why did everybody hate Bill Clinton? They hated Bill Clinton because he was married to Hillary Clinton. That was their problem with Bill. They didn't care about Waco. They cared that he was married to this insufferable woman who won't shut her goddamn trap. And, you know, they called him Billary. And she never won an election, a fair election. You know, she actually had at first stiff competition. I forgot who it was in her first Senate run. And they replaced him with a guy that couldn't possibly win, Rick Lazio, who they might as well have ran him against you or me. Nobody, no name, nobody's for her to win her Senate seat in the first place. Then she ran for president in 2008 and Barack Obama stomped her into the ground. She didn't have a prayer. And then they insisted that she be the nominee, and they did everything they could to screw Bernie Sanders out of it. And this was what was revealed in those emails, this supposed Russian attack on America, assuming that the Russians had anything to do with it at all, which is not proven. All those emails did was reveal what a great Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was and what a wonderful campaign she was running. No. They revealed that she was the scum of the earth, that CNN was rigging the election for her. They had a Pied Piper strategy where they asked all their friends in the liberal media to support Donald Trump because they thought he'd be the one who would be easiest to beat. That was why they would show Donald Trump's empty podium for an hour while Bernie Sanders was giving a speech with a Barack Obama-sized crowd of 3,000 people. Amazing. It's because she was cheating. And then it was revealed that Donna Brazile from CNN was funneling the questions in the debates against Bernie Sanders. And all the different ways they rigged the primaries and everything to make sure that she would screw Bernie Sanders and steal the nomination. And
yeah, I really feel like the Bernie Sanders and Ron Paul had a very similar kind of election where you just see this real groundswell of actual support and then somehow still doesn't come through. It still doesn't actually work. Even though, you know, Ron Paul had blimps and all sorts of people, you know, the whole Tea Party started from that guy.
Well, and, you know, and look, you know what? Sanders and Paul both were running uphill battles in the sense that they were running against the legacy of the sitting president. Ron Paul was a Republican running against George Bush and everything that he had just done. And the Republican Party rank and file, they weren't willing to go ahead and say, oh, yeah, screw George Bush. We never should have elected him twice. That was a really uphill battle for them. And same thing for Bernie Sanders. He couldn't get up there and go, look, Barack Obama may be black, but obviously he's just Hillary Clinton in drag. And he's, you know, he's bad on this, and that. And he didn't prosecute bankers and he went to all these wars. He couldn't do that. He couldn't attack Barack Obama, and he couldn't really attack Hillary Clinton without attacking everything about her that was the same as Barack Obama. So, you know, they both had a handicap there big time in that sense. But so then to the point about the election, though, is that they tried to rig the election against Donald Trump. They brought out all these fake accusations of him being a Russian stooge and everything all summer in 2016. And it still wasn't enough to take the election from him and give it to Hillary Clinton. And this sounds crazy. This sounds like a stupid conspiracy theory because that's how crazy it is. But this is true. And for anyone who doesn't remember, double check that even after he won the election, not only was it floated, but it was publicly supported by the Hillary Clinton campaign that they wanted the CIA to brief the Electoral College, to tell the Electoral College that the Russians had stolen the election from Hillary, so that the Electoral College would then throw the election to the House of Representatives where they could make Colin Powell or Paul Ryan the nominee, which was just absolutely crazy. That was never going to happen. I mean, where do they think these electors come from? The electors come from the state conventions. There's no way in the world they were going to take that away from Donald Trump. And yet that's how hell-bent they were at the time. And, you know, I said this before and someone didn't remember. They went and checked and there it was, the big headline in the New York Times. Hillary Clinton campaign refuses to give up, wants the CIA to tell the Electoral College to deny the victory to Donald Trump. Because, you know, the Electoral College doesn't vote until December 15th or whatever it is. And so they really were trying to push for that, unbelievably, but in fact. So, in other words, yes, they can rig the election, but only on the margin. Comes down to it, they were unable to stop Donald Trump no matter how bad they tried. Now, as to how bad of a warmonger he is, well, he said basically Donald Trump's deal is to take both sides of every issue. So in the campaign, he said, we're going to shore up Social Security and we're going to abolish big government and welfare for all time. Right. So you pick which one you like. And he said, you know what? We need to. The Iraq war was the dumbest thing that ever happened. We never should have done that. We never should have let the Republicans take us into these horrible, disastrous wars. Also, we're going to bomb the hell out of ISIS and we're going to kill their moms and their little sisters. And we're going to bring back torture. And so if you want a hawk, you have a hawk. If you're sick and tired of these wars and you want a dove, then you've got your dove. It just depends on which things he says that you want to hear. Now, so the reality is he immediately backed away, or almost immediately backed away from regime change in Syria. And 1 year ago, basically 6 months into his presidency, he called off CIA support for al-Qaeda and their friends in Syria and basically created the policy that we're going to go ahead and let Assad, Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah finish off these guys. And we're in the process. That's almost done now. The only terrorist stronghold left in Syria is in the Idlib province in the northwest of the country. And the final assault against Idlib, they're preparing for it now. So the civil war there is all but won. At the same time, he's escalated the war in Afghanistan, escalated the war against the Islamic State in Iraq and in Syria, although that part is mostly wrapped up now. He's escalated Barack Obama's war. There's 2 different wars in Yemen right now. One of them is against Al-Qaeda. The other one is for Al-Qaeda, against their enemies, the Houthis. So we're fighting, and this is Barack Obama's doing, fighting 2 wars for and against Al-Qaeda at the same time there. And Barack Obama has only escalated both. So he's escalated CIA drone strikes against Al-Qaeda and even sent in special operations forces on the ground against them, while at the same time also escalating support for the Saudis and their war that's basically for Al-Qaeda against their enemies, the Houthis there. And he sent in infantry, not just special operations forces, but he sent in the infantry to double down on the war in Somalia. And, there's a story in the Washington Post where he is complaining. They're like, why do we even have that troops in Somalia anyway? This is a war that George Bush started in 2006 and Barack Obama expanded the whole time. And Trump complains, why do we even have troops in Somalia? And the quote, according to the Post, is that General James Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, told him, "You have no choice. You have to."
Amazing.
And so what do you do?
What do you think of the
and send in infantry on the ground to escalate that war there? And then the entire SOCOM, Special Operations Command, is expanding all through Africa. And so you have drone wars in Niger and in Nigeria, and spies and special operations forces on the ground in Mali and in Sierra Leone and Burkina Faso and God knows where else in sub-Saharan Africa. And so in other words, he's escalated the war on terrorism, but he has quite correctly decided it's time to stop doing the war for terrorism other than in Yemen. It's time to stop doing the war against these secular dictators like Saddam Hussein, Abdullah Saleh in Yemen, Gaddafi in Libya, Assad in Syria. He said, that's crazy. There's no reason to keep overthrowing and doing regime change against these non-compliant dictators, which only sows chaos and creates further breeding grounds for Al-Qaeda type terrorists. But at the same time, and this really must be said, he has told the military to relax the rules of engagement as far as they possibly can without breaking the law. He has
what does that mean?
Authority over who's allowed to call in strikes all the way down to the battlefield colonel level or lower. And so when they dropped that Moab bomb, the mother of all bombs, the massive ordnance air penetrator or whatever, in Nangarhar province in eastern Afghanistan, that wasn't Trump that did that. That was the commander of SOCOM in Afghanistan, the guy in charge of the Green Berets there. It was revenge because the so-called ISIS forces there had killed a Green Beret. And so as revenge, they went and rolled this bomb out of the back of a C-130 and blasted the hell out of them, which only increased recruitment for the enemy, by the way, unsurprisingly. But there's a new report that just came out from the Pentagon themselves that said that they are now bombing Afghanistan. In the last year, they have dropped more bombs on Afghanistan than any year since the height of the Obama surge in 2011, and with massive civilian casualties to go along with that. Same thing in Yemen, same thing in Somalia, same thing in Syria, where whatever you got to do, go ahead and do it.
So you never really hear about this stuff.
Barack Obama had like tighter rules of engagement have been called off.
Yeah, that's something you really never hear about in the news, right, Tatiana? I mean,
right?
You think, the wars.
Well, we've only got 4 minutes left with him, so I want to hear any other information we got. Like, I get it, it sucks. What else happened? We've got 4 minutes.
Yeah. Well, okay. So you asked me like what to do about it. So my idea, and we kind of skipped this part. I did mention about George H.W. Bush invading Iraq and basing troops in Saudi Arabia. And of course, support for Israel is a major part of this and their massive crimes that they perpetrate against the Lebanese and the Palestinians. This is what brought on our terror war in the first place. Al-Qaeda were the Egyptian Islamic Jihad and the Saudi veterans of the Afghan war that the CIA supported against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan as part of the old Cold War. And then when George Bush occupied Saudi Arabia and Bill Clinton kept that occupation going in the 1990s, that's what really turned them against us, culminating in all the attacks of the 90s and then up to September 11th. Then September 11th became the excuse for all the rest of these wars and conflicts that they've launched since then, including, as I was mentioning, these secular dictators, none of whom had the slightest thing to do with Al-Qaeda or the attack on the United States whatsoever. It just became the cover for that. The terror war serving as the umbrella for these smaller proxy wars against enemies that they, hated for other reasons. And so and then, as I mentioned, George Bush turned Western Iraq into Jihadistan. Barack Obama, by supporting these guys, turned it into the Islamic State for 3 full years there, and has led to this massive sectarian civil war between the Iranian-backed Shia and the Saudi-backed Sunnis all across the region there. So all of this is America's fault. All of this has been brought on by the USA. And so So the reason I like to emphasize all that, it was America that picked the fight with Al-Qaeda, that created Al-Qaeda, and then picked the fight with them and turned them against us. And it was America who created this massive sectarian war across the Middle East. That ought to inoculate you against the next set of lies about who we have to attack in the Middle East. Now you know better. Now you know that whenever they say, here's the reason we have to attack X, Y, or Z country over there, that it just isn't true. That's what you said about Gaddafi, and now they have literal chattel slavery there again under this jihadist regime. Okay, that's what you said about Syria, and you got 100,000, hundreds of thousands of people killed for nothing. And Assad still survives anyway. And if he'd fallen, we'd literally have Al-Qaeda guys ruling Damascus. So now you can never fall for these lies again. And then the same thing with Russia. It wasn't the Russians after the Soviet Union fell who expanded their military alliance into Western Europe in violation of their promise. It was America that betrayed their promise, which is now we have it in writing. It's in the National Security Archive at George Washington University, that they swore to Gorbachev they would not expand NATO east, and then they did it anyway. It was America that overthrew the government in Ukraine and picked this fight. It was America that, again, started this conflict in Syria, which the Russians have gotten in on. And so when they tell you Russia, 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 Vladimir Putin is the new czar, he's the new Stalin, he's intent on invading and conquering the rest of Eastern Europe like it was in the bad old days, you know better. And so I don't know what to do about it, other than to try to get people to understand that even if you're from here, like I am, like you are, Tatiana, even if you're an American and you love America, that doesn't mean that this isn't all goddamn Bill Clinton, George Bush, and Barack Obama's fault. It is. It's exactly their fault. And so the next set of lies, we ought to be impenetrable. It ought to never work on us again. And you do see this. It's finally sinking in. People are looking at the war in Afghanistan and they're saying 17 years of fighting the Taliban? This doesn't make sense on the face of it. You don't have to be an expert to know that 17 years of war and on our 18th general over there, this isn't right. And we don't really care if we win or lose now, whether you call it defeat or victory. It's time to get the hell out of Afghanistan. Everybody can agree on that now. We ought to all know better than that now. And that's really my message, is just, I don't care which party it is or which politician it is. Anybody telling you that this stuff is necessary because America must defend X, Y, or Z from A, B, or C, it's just not true. It couldn't possibly be true.
Yeah.
Man, that was like like ending. Scott, you're amazing. Thank you so much for joining us. I don't want to keep you from your next show. Where can people find you? Are you still on Twitter? Fill me in. Fill in the audience where they can catch up with you.
Well, I'm mostly kicked off of Twitter. You know, I've been looking for an excuse to quit it anyway, but I'm actually about to do the Dan McAdams show with Peter Van Buren to talk about that right now. But people can, I have my own little private Reddit group now at /Scott Horton Show if people want to join up that. And my interview archive, I got 4,700 something interviews at scotthorton.org for you.
Amazing.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And how's the Libertarian Institute? People should go there too, right? Are you still doing that?
Libertarianinstitute.org. That's me and Sheldon Richmond and Jared LaBelle there.
Very cool. And thank you, you know, for working with Zencash. I'm glad that that worked out too. So I like my cryptos mixing with my peace people. Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today. Hell yeah. Anytime, bud. Thanks. Josh,
thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. Josh, that was such a cool show, right? I effing love it when Scott comes on. I'm like, Josh, don't interrupt. I'm like, these are pearls. He goes on these rants. I love it. But you know what I wanted to talk about? You need to
get your rant surfboard out so you can just ride it down.
Ride the wave. You know what I wanted to talk about though was we haven't talked about what's going on with WikiLeaks. Have you been paying attention?
Man, you know, not really. All I know is that Julian Assange is still stuck in that embassy. It's
no. They said that they're like forcing him out now.
Really?
Yeah, no. The Ecuadorian embassy is basically kicking him out, and they're rescinding their like immunity or something. All right, clearly we shouldn't have this as a topic on the show because neither of us are educated about it.
I'm definitely going to start looking it up and researching. Wow.
Well, no, it made me feel so sad because I started thinking about poor Julian Assange and what's going to happen to him. Because, you know, I think, you know, I feel like a little bit like a closet Trump fan. Not really, because I don't really like him. But a little part of me really does, because he's hilarious, right? And he's always making fun of the state, and it's just like a disaster, and nobody believes in the state anymore. And once in a while, I think he falls on something good.
Yeah, but, and come on, that whole North Korea thing is hilarious.
Hilarious. And I like what he did with North Korea. I was like, fine. It was amazing. Yeah. It was the best trolling. It turned out all right, I guess. Anyway, not my point. What's going to happen with him in WikiLeaks, though? Because Julian Assange theoretically helped him win the elections, blah, blah, blah. They were like buds. Yeah. So I'm very curious what's going to happen. And I really hope nothing bad, because Julian Assange and all those WikiLeaks people are so remarkable. And America, freedom of the press, is the one that's trying to take them out. I mean, it's just so heartbreaking, you know?
Yeah. No, this is really a large decision if Trump, decides to bring him home, or bring him not home, but
I think people won't like Trump anymore if he does that. If he tortures Julian, I think a lot of people are going to turn against him, because there's no real reason for that. And also, it is freedom of the press. Yeah, you know, period. Like that should be the main thing. You're president. You're supposed to uphold the Constitution, right? Isn't that the deal? So I don't know.
So. I think it would be a very, very tough PR game for the whole Trump administration, because there's still these staunch, you know, neocons that would be like, no.
No, but he was all about Julian Assange during the election. So he shouldn't, you know what I mean? Like, his people should be pissed if he changes his mind, because that's not right. Who cares what the neocons think? They didn't like him anyway. Or maybe they did and they were all in bed together. Who knows?
Nice. But yeah, interesting stuff. Now,
yeah, you know, we've got some really cool episodes coming up. So I'm you know, going to be taking off some time this summer. We're going to be hanging ourselves in that cruise together, actually.
Yeah, I know. It's exciting. We're going to do some shows on the cruise.
Yeah, so next week, I think we're going to talk about Proof of We Cans, which is POWH.io. It's this weird, like, scam thing, but I don't think it's a scam. I think it's brilliant. And some people think it's retarded. And I don't know. Maybe it is. Maybe it's not. We're going to find out. But we got, like, a pro and an anti. And I'm trying to get the developers who are anonymous, who run FOMO and POWH.io, or whatever it is, Proof We Cans. I'm trying to get them to come on. So I might ask questions over Twitter, because everybody, you know what I'm talking about, right? I sent you the whole thing. So yeah, people could do some research, look at it, and we'll find out. I actually sent it over to an economist friend of mine, and he's not going on the record yet because he wants to learn more about it. But he said it actually didn't seem like a Ponzi, like people are positing. It's not quite that either. So he was intrigued by it.
Like a transparent Ponzi, except I think there have been reports that the smart contract is seizable by the creators, so they could.
So that actually is not what. So there is a whole big thing about it, and it turns out that the big deal they made out of the exploit was not what they made it seem like. So I'm interested. We're going to find out. And
we're going to find
also
out.
anybody can, the contract's open. So anybody who doesn't like it can just go and look at it, right? I mean, there's nothing stopping from anyone from auditing it.
Now, guys, out there, if you love or hate these people, you know, jump on the chat while we're live, because we've got this chat. Make sure